Well, good afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing? Are y'all excited? Well, welcome to the Good News Conference here in Phoenix. Such a beautiful resort. Very honored to be here with all of you for the next couple of days, witnessing and learning from so many wonderful teachers, evangelists, other witnesses. My name is Jared Zimmerer, and I am the Senior Director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I am honored to be your Master of Ceremonies today and this evening. Over the next few days, I just look forward to meeting more of you and really spending a few days refocusing on the lives and the joy and the love that comes from being a disciple of Jesus Christ. You know, the theme of this year's conference is one that is really near and dear to the heart of all of us at Word on Fire. You know, if you've been following Bishop Barron's work for the past couple of years, in fact, one of our leading principles, our guiding principles, is called leading with beauty. So as you'll hear over the next several days, beauty has this unique place in the order of the cosmos, you know, in the life of an evangelist and especially in the life of Christ, understanding the beauty that emanates from the passion and death and resurrection of our Lord. So in an age like our own, often filled with so much contempt and strife, beauty offers this unique path to the heart of mankind. Beauty has this unique capacity to break down those walls of disagreement or hatred and instead open up the mind and the heart of the person in front of us. As I said, I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you for the next few days. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, from Father Mike Schmitz to Dr. Elizabeth Lev, from Jonathan Rumi and Maria Vargo to Andrew Petiprin, Todd Warner, Teresa Tomio, John Ricardo, and of course Bishop Robert Barron. The next few days are just going to be absolutely incredible. I'd like to thank a few people while I'm up here as well. First, to thank John Hale and the whole team at Corporate Travel. Just absolutely wonderful, saintly people to work with. I truly appreciate everything they do. I'd also like to thank our own John Barron at Word on Fire and the whole Word on Fire team for planning and strategizing this absolutely wonderful event. And then I'd also like to thank all of our sponsors. I highly encourage all of you to go visit their booths to learn more about what these wonderful ministries and outreaches are doing in our culture, and especially for our church, and perhaps how we can get involved ourselves. And lastly, I want to thank all of you. I don't know all of your stories, but I know being here is a great sign of a desire to serve the church, a desire to evangelize, a desire to introduce people to the life and love of Jesus Christ. So thank you for everything that you do in your own way. Before I begin my keynote portion, there are just a few kind of small bits of housekeeping. And first is that if any guests had a desire for any of the options that were available, those options are in the back of your name tags. So if you don't happen to see them, check the back. If you don't see them, go check with the great team at Corporate Travel. I'm sure they'll be happy to help out. Secondly, to take a note that the program book is color-coded. So if you look at the schedule, the color on the schedule corresponds to the color, and this is, of course, in the program, to the color coding on the map. And then lastly, if anyone has any mobility issues, there are actually golf carts available for you to travel from one place to another. And if you need a stairless option, all you need to do is ask the golf cart driver to take you to a stairless option. So know that those are available for you. All right, so as I said, my name is Jared Zimmerer, and I'm the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute. I'm a married man. Like a lot of good Catholics, I met my wife in a bar in college. And we've been hanging out for about 17 years now, 15 of those being married. We have four boys and 2 girls, so 6 total children. And I have been in ministry in a voluntary or full-time capacity for well over 20 years. And it's funny, when I tell people I work with Bishop Barron and I tell them I get to travel with him pretty regularly, you know, there's these ideas of glamour, and don't get me wrong, it's wonderful. I've gotten to go to Ireland, all over the United States. But there's a pretty funny story about a time that we went to the Philippines. So this was about 6 or 7 years ago when the International Eucharistic Congress was going on in Manila. And I was invited to travel with Bishop Barron and get to participate and, of course, kind of make sure he is where he needs to be while we're there. And I'm traveling from Dallas to LAX, and that flight is delayed. So I get to LAX, And I run over to the Philippine Airlines, hey, I can't, if you've ever been to LAX, good luck getting to your gate in about 20 minutes. There's just no way. So I asked the wonderful Filipino ladies there, please help me get across the airport. So it's me and 3 Filipino ladies sprinting from the main area all the way to my gate. And my buddy is standing at the gate saying, don't shut the door yet, I know he's coming. I get there and I'm sweating, and I've got a 14-hour flight ahead of me. So I get to Manila, and come to find out, the luggage did not get on our plane. So I'm stuck in Manila. All I had was an extra pair of gym shorts in my backpack. So I go to the hotel. Our host says, hey, why don't you come to my house? I've got a cousin about your size. I'm 6'5". I just don't see how that's going to work. So the team there, wonderful team, but they bring me a bright yellow, like, Big Bird shirt to wear, and all I had was red gym shorts. So I go to Bishop, and I'm like, hey, sorry, this is the only thing I have. And he's like, hey, by the way, Bishop Okeke from Africa wants to go have lunch. So I show up in my red gym shorts and yellow shirt, and I'm meeting the hierarchy of Africa. It's wonderful. So, but no, it was a wonderful trip overall, and of course the faith in the Philippines is just absolutely beautiful. It's just in the water there. Amen to that. So the title of my talk is called Beauty and the Moral Imagination. I'm going to share a bit about why beauty is so important to the human experience. So beauty has this formative nature to it, right? It forms our minds, it forms our imaginations, it forms the very moral reality of which we experience ourselves. So in other words, beauty is a transcendental that if we fill our minds and culture with it, it can cause us to strive for the best ends, the best of what it means to be a human person. However, if not, if we're surrounded by nothing but ugliness, it can lead to an existential disaster. Christopher Dawson, the great historian in England, taught that all of politics and economics are downstream from culture, that what a people worship and fill their imaginations with will eventually become a reality. If you think about our current political reality, I would say that we have filled our imaginations with most often decadence, certainly not beauty in the traditional sense. So people that fill their souls with anything less than that which is the highest will often find themselves in a political and economic mess. So while it is of clear importance to reflect on policy and politics to help heal much of the mess in which we find ourselves today, I believe beauty plays a significant role in redeeming our time. As the great philosopher Roger Scruton once wrote, we live in a time when there is much ugliness around us and much desecration. In many ways, a deliberate making ugly of things, or at least a carelessness as to whether things should be ugly or beautiful. See, beauty, or the lack thereof, forms the souls of a people. And I believe, especially as we're talking about evangelization, especially as we're sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, it plays a primary role in how we talk about the gospel, how we live our lives, how we exemplify what it means to be a Christian today. There's actually an excellent couple of videos on YouTube. There's this animator named Hayao Miyazaki. He is a Japanese animator. He's been in the animation game for a good 30 years. If you've ever heard of Spirited Away, several of these other very high-end animations. He went to a modern anime conference, and some of the recent anime animators were sharing some of their work. And this guy, Miyazaki, is very much a humanist. He's a part of the tradition. He's, of course, Japanese tradition. And he said, this looks as if it's been produced by humans who can't stand looking at other humans. He said, we've lost confidence in ourselves. We've lost confidence in what it means to be a human person if we can't create something beautiful, if we can't lead with that which is beautiful, with that which is great in the aesthetic realm. So one of the dangers that we run into when we're talking about beauty, especially with the beautiful tradition that we have, is that oftentimes we can become beholden to bygone ages, right? So while speaking of beauty, it isn't that we are advocating for some bygone era, but like perhaps the Middle Ages or the Italian Renaissance, as wonderful and beautiful as those are. But rather, we can live within the great tradition without being beholden to it. So a modern artist or someone who wants to share maybe a modern idea of beauty ought to be challenged not to break with tradition, but to recapture it, to operate within the tradition of the great works of art without losing themselves to the past. It connects tradition's certainties with the nature of modern experience, right? In contrast to, let's say, the postmodernist philosophers such as Derrida or Foucault, postmodernism is, I think, in a way we can operate recapturing what it means to be a human person again through the arts. Right? We don't have to revisit those bygone ages, as good as they are, as I said, and we should learn from them and be trained in them, but rather operate in a way, and this is what T.S. Eliot was doing with much of his poetry, is talking about how reality itself broke, especially after the First and Second World War. Something broke in reality. And now we as Christians get to kind of find those little bits and pieces of truth. As we know as Catholics, that's where the fullest expression of truth is, especially in Jesus Christ. But in the culture, we've got to find what Bishop Barron calls the Christ-hauntedness of culture, right? It may not be so perfectly expressed, but rather you can find where it's at. We're in a postmodern, meaning like the post-liberal or the post-Christian, really, era that we find ourselves in, to find those places of meaning in the modern experience. And oftentimes, in order to do that, it's to participate in the tradition. So it's to point back at the tradition, but yet in the modern experience. So how do we hold on to that which is good, true, and beautiful, but convey it or recapture it in the modern world, especially in the sense that we know that beauty is tied to the good as a transcendental. Therefore, the morals of a people often reflect the beauty or the decadence that surrounds them. So the phrase moral imagination, which is in the title of my talk, actually comes from Edmund Burke, who is, of course, most famously known for his work on the French Revolution. But he also penned a book entitled Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. So the moral imagination is that power of ethical perception which strides beyond barriers of private experience or events in the moment. In other words, we can transcend just our subjective experience. It's not to ignore it, but rather we can transcend it, or even the moments in our time, we can think much more historical. We can think about big picture. So especially, as the dictionary has it, the higher form of this power exercised in poetry and art, and I would add film to that. The moral imagination aspires to the apprehending of right order in the soul and right order in the commonwealth. So as Burke says, the civilized being is distinguished from the savage by its possession of the moral imagination. That's what distinguishes us from the savage. In other words, poetry, film, and art have an essential role in forming the moral imagination. In terms of the function of, let's say, the fine arts, the high arts, beauty forms the moral imagination and is primarily concerned with an intellectual and moral formation of someone who participates in society, right, as a citizen, not just solely for you as an individual, rather you as an individual participating in the larger whole. So the moral imagination is that which distinguishes, as I said, the savage from the civilized. Or to put it in other terms, the moral imagination is that which makes us more fully human. In this view, one of the primary purposes of poetry, film, and art is to awaken the moral imagination and to provide an experience of formation in which makes man more fully alive. So ignoring the moral imagination makes man into nothing more than a beast, whereas recognizing it glorifies and awakens the powers of the soul. One of my great heroes who I actually wrote my dissertation on is Russell Kirk. He was very heavily involved in studying this idea of the moral imagination. And he said, quote, "The moral imagination is the principal possession that man does not share with the beasts. It is man's power to perceive ethical truth, abiding law in seeming chaos and of many events. Without the moral imagination, man would live merely from day to day, or rather moment to moment, as dogs do. It is a strange faculty, inexplicable if men are assumed to have an animal nature only." So in this faculty, you discern greatness, justice, order. You move beyond the bars of self-interest and disordered passions and disordered appetites. In other words, the moral imagination shows us what we ought to be. Now, that term ought is a very important distinction because, in the modern world, which is so wrecked with relativism, the idea of objective oughts, the idea of an objective moral truth that we all ought to strive for, the idea of a final cause, our telos, why we exist, has been completely ignored. But in the moral imagination, it immediately awakens, what am I meant for? Where am I going? What is my life purpose? What is my meaningfulness of life? Right? And in the moral imagination, especially experienced through beauty, that all awakens and you start to experience and come to love that which you ought to love. So a true understanding of beauty must consider the moral formation of the human person and what it takes to rightly order the soul. As I said, Russell Kirk, one of my great heroes, he said that order within the soul spills order into the commonwealth. Right? So as we order our own soul, it now spills into our political, economic, cultural institutions. Roger Scruton makes an important argument that beauty must be considered with the same objectivity that we judge virtue and vice. He says, quote, "Beauty is therefore as firmly rooted in the scheme of things as goodness. It speaks to us, as virtue speaks to us, of human fulfillment, not of things we want, but of things we ought to want, because human nature requires them," end quote. Man knows he ought to live virtuously, even if he does not quite have the language or self-consciousness to be able to articulate what that means. So in the beauty of the arts, particularly the written arts such as poetry and literature, we experience something through the senses that is then judged in our minds. So a truly beautiful piece of poetry or literature causes that judgment to desire what human beings might ought to desire. Right? So for example, the many sacrifices of Frodo on his way to Mount Doom, the awakening one feels when reading T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, or the invigoration of Wagnerian extremes cause mankind to desire something greater than himself, something beyond mere fleeting happiness or fleeting joy. So much like virtue, if the desire is improperly ordered, then it is utmost importance that the person experiencing that awakening of the moral imagination discern and reflect on how he might rightly order those desires. There's great danger in ignoring the moral imagination. Again, here's Kirk. Quote, "If the moral imagination is denied or suppressed, the person and the republic are bewildered. The decadent logicalism of our century, reflected in much of our literature, is the death to the moral imagination, so that we must retrace our steps or perish. Unless humane literature is returned to its normative purpose," right? The idea of norms, the idea of oughts, telling us what we ought to be as truly human beings, the degradation of the human condition cannot be delayed, end quote. So sadly, as I said, the moral imagination is often ignored, and today it's replaced by numerous isms. So logicalism, determinism, scientism, materialism, atheism. And these no longer awaken in man the proper desire for order, virtue, human dignity. One of the problems of modernity is a loss of certain norms as they especially pertain to art, especially as they pertain to beauty. Beauty is not necessarily in the eye of the beholder. There is a subjective experience to beauty, but rather beauty calls forth something out of you, right? It's objective. It's something that it's calling you to participate in. So until very recent years, men took it for granted that literature exists to form the normative conscience. Right? As I said, when you experience something like, say, Frodo going to Mount Doom, or many of the Dickens novels, there's something that happens within your own conscience that you start to learn what's right and wrong. Not from a kind of argumentative perspective that I'm telling you what's right or wrong, but rather now you've experienced why it's right. You've experienced the sadness, the empathy with these characters. You've experienced what it means to have courage, even though you didn't personally go on that journey to Mount Doom. You now know what it means to be a courageous, virtuous human being. So Edmund Burke also says that art is man's nature. So numerous philosophers have written on the distinction of mankind from the other animals, and that mankind is the sole creature that creates. Many of these philosophers point to the cave painting as a prime example. But I'm sure, as all of you know, no other animal could possibly write Hamlet or compose a symphony. I think immediately of the great letter from Hamlet to Ophelia. He says, "Doubt thou the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love." Nobody else except human persons can create something like that. And see, just reading that, there was an emotion probably that came out, something that's beautiful in those words that desires you to experience, what is that love? What does it mean to doubt reality itself, but yet to believe this love of this person to me? Right? In the normative nature of literature, of poetry, of film, we experience these things through beauty, and they awaken our moral imagination. So then, by knowing what's right and wrong, and living in accord with what's right, the human person lives a life fully. He's happiest when he lives a life of virtue and hope and joy, when his soul is properly ordered to what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. So through great art, we come to know and desire what we ought to know. The term fine arts actually stems from the word finis, or ends, right? In our time, the telos, or the end, the final cause of a thing is often mostly ignored. But the arts were always meant for the best end of mankind. It tells you what you ought to be, where you ought to be going with your life. These oughts are the norms of a healthy human society, or what T.S. Eliot calls the permanent things. A norm is an enduring standard, a rule of human conduct, and a measure of public virtue. A norm is not the average or the mediocre, nor is it limited to one source. It is a rich patrimony of wisdom. So art, whether, again, literature, poetry, film, or other means, they ought to express these norms in a way that inspires adherence. Art awakens the imagination, the active intellect, and provides the vision of how a properly ordered soul ought to look. The moral imagination and art have a very similar end, which is to awaken the beholder to a sense of the eternal, permanent things and the wisdom of tradition. So as I said, beauty contains a certain amount of formation, of formative art, much like virtue. So in using the language of virtue, if you think of something like bravery or courage, which is in Aristotle placed between cowardice and rashness, beauty actually does have a golden mean. It's between ugliness and what we might call gaudiness, right? So right judgment then of an art or beauty requires a formation in the characteristics of beauty and the humility of the person judging them to reach the desire he ought to have. So for example, if you don't like Bach, it's likely not Bach. It's likely you've got to awaken your senses. You might have to learn a little bit more about symphonies and about instruments and all of that to be able to get it. I'll never forget. So when I was in high school, my lowercase g god was sports. That's really all I cared about. You'd have to tape my eyes open just to read a book. That was just not my thing. But then my senior year, an atheist professor at a Catholic school read Shakespeare to me for the first time in a way that I got it. I was like, wait a minute, these words mean all of that? These characters mean all of this? They're telling all of these human stories in such a beautiful way. Yet it still took me quite some time to actually be able to participate in it by myself. I had to go back to teachers. I had to go back to reference books. I had to really learn the craft and what Shakespeare was doing in order to participate in it fully and fully understand it. Just now, I'm trying to get into opera. It's taking me some time. But I went to my first Wagner about a year ago, and I'm trying to better understand what's going on. And once you do, you've now formed your imagination to that which is beautiful. Rather than saying at first glance, well, I know this has been very popular for about 800 years, but I don't get it. Rather it's, I know this has been popular for 800 years. There's something enduring to it. Let me try. Let me work my way towards it. As Antonin Scalia always says, you don't judge Shakespeare, Shakespeare judges you, right? It turns back towards us and asks us, how much do you want what you ought to want? It challenges us, and sometimes we have to push ourselves intellectually. We have to push our hearts, our minds, our souls in order to better understand it. But once you get it, now you have something that you can invite people into. You have something that you can express in a way that participates in the gospel and in your work as an evangelist. So in a very kind of practical way, one of the things I like to share a lot when talking about beauty and the moral imagination, again, coming from Russell Kirk, in perhaps one of his best essays entitled The Architecture of Servitude and Boredom, he shares a story regarding the urban riots in 1981 in Britain. He had asked a very knowledgeable Scotsman engineer about what had caused the troubles in Edinburgh, to which the Scotsman answered, bad architecture. I don't know how many sociologists would answer that, bad architecture as a reason for riots. But in the essay, Kirk argues that the postmodern architecture has left man surrounded by boring conditions, right? Non-inspiring. If not even non-inspiring, almost uninspiring, trying to push you down, not remind you of what it means to be a human person, what beauty actually is. So from the police stations to the communal housing, the outward appearance has left residents without any sense of wonder and imagination. Bad design led to decadence and feelings of servitude. The monotony of what he calls the modern proletarian cosmopolis has left the natives restless. So Kirk's primary objective of the essay is not only to point out the problem, but also to find a solution. So for some reason, modern solutions to the issues have not cured the wound. As he says, quote, not infrequently, the public authorities are moved to relieve the barrenness of their urban landscapes by commissioning somebody to design, for a delightful fee, another piece of junk sculpture, a product of the blowtorch, to be erected in some place of public assembly. Public funds have been made available lavishly to encourage such artistic frauds. Yet somehow these contributions to a city's amenities do not restore civic virtue. The rates of murder, rape, and arson continue to rise. There's an excellent documentary that Roger Scruton did on the nature or the architecture in Detroit. I would highly recommend looking up on YouTube, just look up Roger Scruton Beauty, and it'll take you right to it. It's a very interesting kind of perspective of how the surrounding nature of architecture affects the morality, the kind of desire to live to those highest ends in a very interesting way. So Kirk explains that when humanity is surrounded by bad architecture and worse art, morality will come to reflect such decadence. In other words, surround mankind with ugliness, and he will be ugly. Art forms man's moral order. It's interesting that Kirk was talking about the blowtorch stuff. I mean, where I'm from in North Texas, that stuff's everywhere, and I can never guess what it is. So Kirk was deeply convinced or convicted that the mission to beautify cities again would be part of getting us up and out of this feeling of decadence, this feeling of meaninglessness. If you've been paying attention to any of the kind of Catholic integralism arguments, I think one of the best ones is the necessity of beautifying American cities again, beautifying cities across the world, but thinking particularly as American. Sadly, as I said, modernity has handed over what was traditionally created by attachments to family, to religion, to tradition, to what he calls the bureaucrats, scientists, technocrats, trade union organizers, publicity experts, sociologists, and professional politicians. Artistic expression has been vulgarized through a removal of what it makes for a humane formation. So he suggested 4 general principles of urban restoration, and honestly, I'm sharing these because I think they're also just interesting principles to keep in mind, even as we go into our own homes, as we go into our parishes, as we participate in our local communities. What are some ways we can enact these things so that we can beautify our local areas? Again, starting with our own families. He said that these 4 principles might help to redeem this country from boredom and servitude. So these principles are, 1, the architecture of a city and a countryside ought to be adapted to the humane scale. 2, the community called a city must nurture roots, not hack through them. 3, the measure of urban planning should not be commercial gain primarily, but the common good. 4, civic restoration must be founded upon the long-established customs, habits, and political institutions of a community. So that first principle, which is based on the humane scale, so what Kirk means by this is, quote, a society is not a machine. It is a kind of spiritual cooperation. And if treated as a machine, people rebel politically and personally, end quote. Man must not be thought of as a cog in the wheel of society. If the environment surrounding him is nothing more than a conglomeration communicating use of mankind, man will naturally desire to break free from those anti-humanistic modalities of life. Right? If you remember, John Paul II said the opposite of love is not hate, the opposite of love is use. How much of our communities are communicating that very thing? So left unchecked, city planning can quickly come to look like the City of London in George Orwell's 1984, in which the buildings are described as cold, dingy, rotten, patched with cardboard, and their roofs with corrugated iron. The humane scale is based on a personalistic understanding that man is far more than a collectivity. Funnily enough, Kirk actually wrote ghost stories, and oftentimes the city planner was often the villain. So in the second principle, Kirk explains the necessity of roots in both a practical and philosophical sense. He says neighborhoods, voluntary associations, old landmarks, historical monuments, such elements make men and women feel at home. They bind together a community with what Gabriel Marcel calls diffused gratitude. Restoration and rehabilitation always are preferable to reconstitution. So by diffused gratitude, what Marcel means by that is the memory of the past rooted in creativity and fidelity, right? So fidelity to the past, but also operating in a new, creative, kind of modern form. So the gratitude we feel is diffused because it's not directed to a multitude of dead people, but to the spirit embodied in the figure in the past who discovered the world that we now value today, the one that inspires us. For example, I actually have a brother that's a seminarian right now down in Covington, Louisiana, and which is the birthplace and home place of the great novelist and philosopher Walker Percy. In a wonderful little park just up from the seminary, he's actually buried at the seminary cemetery. There's a statue in which he appears to be leaning on and peeking through a doorway. Upon the doorway, around the side and around the top, are the titles of his numerous books. That simple historical monument invites the locals and visitors to consider the life and work of a man who lived and walked these streets, the very streets that we're now walking. It provides a sense of history, of belonging, of inspiration, and as Kirk says, of roots. This principle honestly might put Kirk at odds with the current situation in the United States, which calls for the tearing down of numerous statues that represent a certain understanding of history. The recent cancel culture desires to erase the histories of many of the founding fathers, as well as writers such as Flannery O'Connor and missionary saints like Junipero Serra. And of course, Cook would vehemently disagree with the erasure of the past in such a progressive fashion. But he might also challenge the anger with a reminder that the present is certainly not stuck in the past. Rather, like the humane writer he is, he might remind people of their history in its fullest form, scars and all. When the public gains such insight, we can understand our roots without desiring to rip them out. Right? In this way, art, beauty reminds a community of where it comes from, and perhaps what we don't want to repeat. Even of our own family lines, we all have that horse thief in our family lines that we're like, yeah, don't really want to talk about him, but he is part of the family line. The third principle calls for architecture of the common good, or for the common good. Commercial gain is not a god to be worshipped. Rather, an understanding of the human person as far more than what you might call homo economicus, or worth only what he can produce, leaves a sense that a man is meant for higher and better things. By common good, we mean a good that is ontologically oriented toward what is best for humanity, based on the ideals of real human flourishing. Architecture can make or break a community if it represents the wrong values. So in this principle, Kirk is also concerned with the common good in the sense that what is best for the entire community and not just for the wealthy. So when housing is built and given a pricing structure that the poor cannot afford, causing the poor to vacate, the common good is breached and the humane scale has now been tipped. So consideration of the entire community. The fourth principle focuses on the historical process through which a community reached the current reality, meaning Kurt mentions the customs, habits, and political institutions as they represent the means by which that specific community knows itself. right? So thinking of Covington, Louisiana, they are big on shrimp and certain kinds of beer, right? That's a custom, a habit that's part of who you are as a Covington, Louisianan, right? Not something to be ignored, something to celebrate, right? One of the things that G.K. Chesterton was so afraid of was these big box stores that eventually all the cities would have the same restaurants, the same grocery stores, the same experience. I don't know about you, but I've been in a ton of American cities, and it feels that way pretty regularly. So recapturing, reminding ourselves of what it means to live in a certain place, a certain form of community. So architecture ought to represent the people who inhabit the very environment in which they are placed. This environment ought to memorialize what makes that territory unique. As an aesthetic principle, it appears Kirk celebrates the different cultures and the numerous architectural expressions. However, diversity of forms ought to come naturally from within and not forced or top down. These four principles represent a few practical means to operate in the aesthetic space. If one were to put these in kind of a Kirkian aesthetic terms, art must, 1, be humane, that is, it must speak to the dignity of the human person. 2, it must nurture roots and gratitude for tradition. 3, it must exist for the common good and not just for commercial outcomes. And 4, come from within a tradition and custom. The interesting thing about Kirk, as much as he pinned himself as a traditionalist, he was never opposed to a certain type of progress. In fact, he really loved the strange and the weird. He's often named as kind of the father of the conservative movement, but I would certainly say he fit in way more with the Addams family than Leave It to Beaver. He was a pretty odd guy. Instead, he never wanted tradition to be overridden by the cult of progress, meaning that as long as a new thing came along, in this case, artistic expression, it must find itself within the great tradition and not opposed to it. The boredom and servitude that Kirk is rightfully fighting against is an existential angst that occurs in the aesthetic environment surrounding a person when it's opposed to the tradition that understands what mankind needs, especially for fulfillment based on the wisdom and the centuries before us. One of the concerns of this idea of the way of beauty is how to capture the postmodern imagination. So one of the effects of true beauty is that it leads the beholder to a contemplative posture during the experience. I don't know if you've seen the Sistine Chapel, or there's certain, symphonies that you can listen to. It leads you to think. It leads you to a moment of almost meditation, or as he says, contemplation. The fine arts especially have a way in which to raise the soul of the beholder to something higher than themselves and urges one to desire, as I said, the right things. Aristotle actually taught in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics that perfect happiness is a contemplative activity. And what I'm saying is that beauty has a very unique ability to cause contemplation in a person, to sit there and really meditate, to think through what's going on in this piece. Or if you're looking at the Sistine Chapel or some other beautiful piece, that it causes you to really wonder what's going on. It awakens the intellect, it awakens the imagination. So as I said, Scruton proposed that beauty ought to be considered in the same language of the good. So along with Aristotle's use of contemplation as the highest form of the good life, artistic expression and artistic experience, as someone, I am not a painter, not a drawer, not a musician, but I love those things, so our subjective experience of those things, they provide or they encourage us to live in accord with the best of human nature. Goodness and beauty differ, however, slightly in how they cause contemplation. Thomas Aquinas wrote that, quote, beauty and good in a subject are the same, for they are based upon the same thing, namely the form. So the form, the ideal of beauty and goodness. And consequently, good is praised as beauty. So for example, when you look at Mother Teresa doing the good work of serving the poor, there's something beautiful about it, right? You may not be able to particularly put language on it, but it awakens something in you that something happening here is beautiful. Thomas continues, he says, but they differ logically, for good properly relates to the appetite, meaning good being what all things desire, and therefore it has an aspect of an end, for the appetite is a kind of movement towards a thing. On the other hand, beauty relates to the knowing power, for beautiful things are those which please when seen. Goodness relates to the appetite, whereas beauty relates to the knowing power, which is important in the judgment of beauty, and therefore the fine arts, films, etc., because it must be considered in light of its effect, being the experience through the senses, and its end, which we said as contemplation and virtuous formation. So beauty breaks upon the beholder, and much like viewing courage or honesty, right? We're inspired by those acts of goodness. We're inspired by the soldier that goes and fights and perhaps dies for his country. We're inspired when a politician stands up for himself or herself as a principled person, right? In the same way, beauty inspires through that experience through the senses a desire for contemplation and virtuous formation. It breaks into the beholder's soul and transforms his desires to desire what they ought to be. Scruton says that beauty, quote, demands an act of attention. Beauty demands an act of attention. So when I said we're trying to capture that postmodern imagination, beauty, unlike anything else, demands an act of attention. So beauty in the form of art, film, literature, poetry are means of formation, virtuous appetite, and contemplation, something that every human being requires and deserves, which is why it is so important for evangelists to understand. Another book that I would highly recommend is Christopher Dawson's book called Religion and Culture. That's where the idea of all politics and economics come down from culture, and by culture he means cultus, the cult, the religious act. So he says, quote, "The recovery of moral control and the return to spiritual order have become the indispensable conditions of human survival, but they can only be achieved by a profound change in the spirit of modern civilization. This does not mean a new religion or a new culture, but a movement of spiritual reintegration which would restore that vital relation between religion and culture, which has existed at every age and on every level of human development," end quote. We live in a time of mass secularization. I'd be hard-pressed, as we said, there's Christ-hauntedness, right? But as a true culture, especially Catholic tradition, I'm excited to hear Bishop Barron's talk this evening about the tradition of beauty in the Catholic tradition. But our current culture, it ignores, or perhaps even worse, it denies any kind of religious act. It doesn't try to imbue any kind of divine worship or divine recognition into it. And sadly, what that's doing is it's forming the imagination. The scholar Anthony Eslin says that if you can't capture a child's imagination, you will lose them. They will leave the church. Because so often we focus on the intellect, not so much on the imagination. So rather, as evangelists, we ought to flood the culture around us, as I said, even in our own homes, with the beauty that inspires those that experience it with a desire for God. We know as Christians that our telos, our end, is to be enraptured within the beatific vision of our Lord. When we experience beauty in the here and now, it reminds us of that end, and it grants us a moment of joy, which is a taste of what is to come in the eschaton. As you all know, we are in a time where one of the greatest losses of modern man is a sense of meaning and purpose. Suicide rates are through the roof right now. And so often that's coming from a place of just meaninglessness. They don't know what that ought is. They don't know what their telos, that final cause, actually is. We are T.S. Eliot's hollow men, seeking momentary pleasures or avoidance of pain because we have no larger sense of life. What beauty can do, unlike much else, is awaken a sense that it is good to be a human person. Let me say that again. What beauty can do, unlike much else, is awaken a sense that it is good to be a human person. I'll end with a quote from Roger Scruton. Of course, he's speaking here of the act of play, or what you might call the enchantment of the imagination. He says, quote, "The activity is all the more necessary in that we are torn in our everyday lives between the severe demands of reason, which require us to live by the rules, and the temptations of sense, which prompt us to venture forth in search of constant new experiences. Rather in play, or what I say, the enchantment, the awakening of the imagination, elevated by art to the level of free contemplation, reason and sense are reconciled, and we are granted a vision of human life in its holiness. As Catholics, we ought to be the champions of beauty, in our lives, in our relationships, in our reading, our music, our artistic expression. We have the fullest sense of what it means to be a human person in the light of Jesus Christ. We have to take the way of beauty very seriously and encourage others as well. So I want to challenge all of you, one, to think about what it is you're filling your own imagination with. How are you forming your moral imagination as it stands today? Scruton talked about the moral imagination being a lifelong process. You're never too far gone, from really taking these things in, learning new things, trying to participate in them in a much higher sense, in order that you can now share it with others. And as I said, when you experience beauty, you're experiencing what is to come, the beatific vision of God. So now whenever you share that beauty with others, they're experiencing something greater than themselves. They're experiencing what is to come in the eschaton, right? And in order to live that out, they now live out the oughts, right? Those norms that I mentioned that come from that experience. So I want to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to meeting all of you as much as I can. A quick reminder, we've got about a 30 to 40 minute break right now, but there's in the Sonoma Sky, we will have the opening rosary and mass, where the most beautiful thing on this earth, which is to take in the body and blood of Jesus Christ into your very body, we'll have an opportunity to do. So thank you so much, and God bless.